Australian government is making a major bet on battery manufacturing, inviting consultation on a national battery strategy earlier this year. The strategy aims to capture a part of the fast-growing lithium-ion industry as the world transitions to low-carbon energy. While Australia produces 52% of the world's lithium, Indonesia is the world's biggest nickel producer, two of the major components of electric car batteries. Joining us now to talk through the importance of the industry in Asia and the relationship between Australia and Indonesia is Australia's former Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment, the Honourable Stephen Ciiobo. Steve, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today. Now, you've got a deep understanding of the importance of the Australia-Indonesia relationship. Now, you were, of course, one of the architects of the Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. How has that relationship evolved?
Well, good morning to you, Oriel, and look, delighted to be with you. The relationship between Australia and Indonesia is one that does continue to evolve, and one that really sees both the Indonesian government and the Australian government deeply committed to forging the synergies that can flow from a strong trade investment relationship between both countries. We recognised that some time ago. That, in many respects, was the precursor to the development of the Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And the synergies that exist really flow because there's opportunity for Australia to be a key supplier, often of unrefined or unprocessed items and materials, which Indonesia, of course, can then value add to. And that's the real synergy that exists between both economies.
So when you look at back at 2019 and you look at what we're seeing today, how much of an impact has the actual agreement had on trade and investment flows between the two countries?
It's still early days, and in many respects, it was, very significantly pushed around by COVID, which interrupted trade and investment flows so significantly. The real proof of this pudding will come over the next 3 to 5 years, but the fact that we're continuing to see both governments build on that platform of IA-CEPA, as it's called, building on that platform with things like the National Battery Strategy, with initiatives such as additional opportunities to develop supply chains built around electric vehicle manufacturers. These are the kinds of initiatives that will use at its core that free trade agreement, that IA-CEPA, and ultimately be a driver of investment and employment in both economies.
So would that include the recent agreement that Indonesia signed to import lithium from Australia?
Look, absolutely. And I know from a number of conversations I've had with ministers in Indonesia that Indonesia very much sees its future as being around EV supply chain. They've also put in place a similar deal with the UK, and Indonesia really wants to position itself across Asia as being the go-to destination. And frankly, we're seeing a number of economies that are looking to exclude China from the supply chain of rare earths and critical minerals. It's very, very heavily skewed toward China in terms of current supply chains, and for a whole array of different reasons, economies and some businesses are looking to diversify away from that. And there's no doubt that Indonesia sees itself playing a role in that regard.
So you were just talking about dollar value. I mean, why do you believe that this industry is just so important to us here in Asia? We talk about a lot, of course. We are big providers of these critical minerals. But is it just about the dollar value? Is it about the dollar value of the growing industry, or is there much more to it?
Well, we know that this is going to be the most significant energy transition that's happening, across the world. There's various forecasts, some up to $10 to $12 trillion that will need to be invested to effectively take what has been a fossil fuel-based energy supply chain to one that's going to be built around, in the main, renewables. Much of that energy transition in the renewables space, whether it's the construction of offshore wind turbines, whether it's solar, across the board, it's going to involve a significant uptick in the requirement for critical minerals and rare earths. There's no doubt that battery supply is going to become, at a network level, a key part of being able to, firm up that baseload power supply from renewables. And in that respect, it's the recognition that we're going to need these minerals to drive that transition that's fundamental to the policy vision that these countries have.
I think those numbers that you were just referring to there, Steve, are key. So if we look at the battery strategy consultation paper from the Australian government and look at some of those numbers, they're saying by 2035, mined materials will be an $11 billion market, but active battery materials will be worth $271 billion. Cell manufacturing will be a $387 billion market. I guess the question then becomes is, how do we position ourselves in Australia? Can Australia actually become a successful battery manufacturer with all that competition in the space?
It is going to be competitive, and these forecasts, of course, are built upon a whole series of different assumptions. But one thing that is incontrovertible is the fact that there's going to be a massive change across the world as we move to a renewables-based energy supply industry. And with that change, Oriel, is going to require investment. It's going to require the creation of a hell of a lot of intellectual property. Now, Australia is positioned very well when it comes to the creation of that intellectual property. Risk tolerance and risk appetite in Australia could probably be a bit higher, frankly, on a global scale. But that's where you see some of these synergies that can exist. Indonesia recognises this as well, as does, frankly, more broadly the ASEAN region. And so there are going to be opportunities to diversify away from, a single supply chain that currently goes through China to one that's more Asia-based, broader, has increased redundancies built in, but also, frankly, one thing that's really been brought to the fore in the last 12 to 24 months has been the significance and importance of energy security. The war in Ukraine and the position that Europe found itself in has underscored for many countries the need to make sure that they have energy security, and that's going to require domestic sovereignty and domestic capability when it comes to these energy supply chains, which again is another driver of the demand for these raw materials, and frankly means Australia is well positioned to supply that into the future.